blood doesn't wash out of white linen. Nia knew that much. So when the translator sitting at table 4 intentionally butchered the negotiation, trading a multi-million-dollar truce for a death sentence, she had a choice. Keep pouring the Bordeaux or risk her life to tell the mob boss the truth. Sweat pooled at the base of Nia's spine, trapped beneath the stiff, synthetic fabric of her uniform. Her arches throbbed. 6 hours into a double shift at L'Orchidée, and the heavy mahogany double doors of the VIP room felt like the gates of hell. Inside, the air was thick. It smelled of roasted bone marrow, sharp garlic, and the suffocating musk of $100 cigars. Nia balanced a silver tray loaded with 4 snifters of imported cognac on her fingertips. Her wrist ached. She pushed the door open with her hip, keeping her eyes cast downward, tracking the geometric patterns of the Persian rug. In this room, eye contact was a liability. At the head of the circular table sat Dominic. He didn't look like the monsters on the evening news. He wore a charcoal suit that fit too well. His tie loosened just a fraction. He smelled of cold ash, mint, and leather. His hands rested flat on the white tablecloth, fingers still, nails perfectly manicured. Beside him sat Gregory, a thin, nervous man with a receding hairline and a silk handkerchief stuffed in his breast pocket. Gregory was the bridge, the translator. Across from them sat Richard. Richard was a phantom in the local underworld, a westernized proxy for a massive overseas syndicate based in Seoul. He was younger than Dominic, sharper around the edges, chewing slowly on a piece of wagyu with a look of utter boredom. Nia stepped up to the table. She placed a coaster beside Richard, then the glass. No clinking. Quiet, invisible service. Richard swallowed his meat and wiped his mouth. He spoke in rapid, guttural Korean, his tone flat, eyes locked on Dominic. Nia moved to Gregory, placing his glass down. She caught the scent of Gregory's cologne, something cloying, overly sweet, desperately trying to mask the sour odor of his fear sweat. "He says the transition of the northern ports will go smoothly," Gregory said in English, turning to Dominic. He smiled, a greasy stretching of his lips. "Mister, Richard assures you that his people will pull their security details back by midnight. The territory is yours." Nia froze. It was a micro stutter in her movement. Her thumb slipped on the edge of Dominic's coaster, nearly tipping the heavy crystal snifter. She caught it, her fingernail scraping against the silver tray. Nobody noticed. Or so she thought. She backed away, retreating to the shadows near the heavy velvet drapes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. She understood Korean. 4 years of avoiding a mountain of student debt had landed her in a cramped apartment in Busan, teaching English to businessmen, soaking up the language until it became second nature. She had left that life behind, trading the neon signs of South Korea for the grim grey sleet of the city, scrubbing plates and pouring wine for criminals who tipped in crisp, uncreased hundreds. It was a secret she kept buried. Fluency meant utility. Utility meant getting dragged into things. But Richard hadn't said they were pulling back their security. Richard had said, "Tell him we accept his terms, make him comfortable. The moment his trucks arrive at the North Dock tonight, we burn them with the drivers inside." Nia stood by the wall, the heavy silver tray pressed flat against her apron. Her mouth tasted like old copper. "Don't say anything," a voice in her head screamed. "It's not your business." She watched Dominic nod slowly. He reached for his cognac. "Tell him I appreciate his cooperation," Dominic murmured. his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated in the quiet room. "Tell him I look forward to a profitable relationship." Gregory turned to Richard. He didn't translate Dominic's words. Instead, Gregory spoke in stilted, heavily accented Korean. "He believes it. You have the green light for tonight. I'll make sure his top men are diverted to the warehouse." Naya's stomach bottomed out. Nausea crashed over her in cold waves. Gregory wasn't just a bad translator. He was a rat. He was setting Dominic up for a slaughter, and he was getting paid by both sides to do it. She looked at Dominic. He took a slow sip of the amber liquid, his dark eyes studying the rim of his glass. If he sent his trucks to the docks tonight, a lot of people were going to die. And then, tomorrow, the Korean syndicate would march into this restaurant, looking for whoever was left of Dominic's crew. Nia closed her eyes. The linen of her apron felt suddenly rough against her skin. She didn't care about Dominic's empire. She didn't care about the mob. But she cared about the collateral. If a gang war erupted, her neighborhood would burn. The crossfire would bleed into the streets she walked home on. She opened her eyes. Gregory was chuckling, raising his glass in a toast with Richard. The sheer, unadulterated smugness on Gregory's face sparked a sudden, irrational spike of anger in Nia's chest. It cut through the fear. He sat there, sweating cheap cologne, signing away lives with a greasy smile. She had to clear the empty plates. It was her job. She took a breath, letting the stale, heavy air fill her lungs, and pushed herself off the wall. Nia approached the table. Her legs felt hollow, like dry reeds ready to snap. The clatter of silverware against china sounded deafening in her own ears. She started with Richard. She picked up his empty plate, her movements sharp, mechanical. Richard didn't even look at her. She was a ghost, a piece of the furniture. She moved behind Gregory. The sour smell of him was overwhelming now. Up close, she could see the fine tremor in his hands. He was terrified, riding the adrenaline of his own betrayal. Nia stacked his plate onto Richard's, her forearm brushing the back of Gregory's chair. Then, "Dominic!" She stepped to his right. She reached for the small bread plate near his elbow. Her hand was shaking. She couldn't stop it. The porcelain rattled against the tray. Dominic's eyes shifted, just a fraction. He didn't turn his head, but she felt the weight of his attention lock onto her. It was heavy, suffocating. "Do it," she thought. "Just drop the plates and run." Instead, Nia leaned in. She let her hip bump the heavy oak table. A clumsy, uncharacteristic mistake. "Pardon me, sir," she whispered, her voice breathy, barely carrying past his shoulder. As she leaned down to wipe a non-existent crumb from the tablecloth, her mouth hovered inches from Dominic's ear. She smelled the leather of his watch strap, the faint, bitter tang of the cognac on his breath. "Your translator is lying," Nia breathed, the words rushing out of her in a single, terrified exhale. "They aren't pulling back. They're burning your trucks at the docks tonight. Gregory is helping them." She stood up instantly. The blood roared in her ears. She grabbed the bread plate, her fingers slipping on the porcelain. She didn't look at Dominic. She couldn't. She turned on her heel and walked toward the double doors, her vision tunneling. Every step felt like walking through wet cement. She expected a shout. She expected a hand to grab her hair, a gun to cock, the sudden, violent shattering of the room's quiet tension. Nothing happened. Nia pushed through the doors and collapsed against the cool tile wall of the service hallway. She squeezed her eyes shut, dragging oxygen into her lungs in shallow, ragged gasps. What had she done? She had just called a mafia lieutenant a traitor to his boss. If she was wrong, if she had misheard the slang, if her Korean was rustier than she thought, Dominic would kill her. If she was right, Gregory would figure out who tipped Dominic off, and he would kill her. Inside the dining room, Dominic hadn't moved. He didn't flinch when the waitress whispered in his ear. He didn't look at her as she practically fled the room. His expression remained entirely neutral, a masterclass in dead-eyed composure. But beneath the table, the muscle in his thigh twitched. He slowly set his glass down. The crystal made a soft clink against the wood. Gregory smiled across the table. Mr. Richard was just saying he knows a great spot for cigars downtown, Dominic, to celebrate. Dominic looked at Gregory, really looked at him. He saw the sheen of sweat on the man's upper lip. He noticed how Gregory's fingers tapped anxiously against his knee. "Is that right?" Dominic said, his voice quiet. He picked up his napkin and methodically wiped his mouth. "Gregory, ask Richard a question for me." "Of course, boss, anything." "Ask him if he prefers the northern warehouses over the southern ones for his imports. Just small talk." Gregory nodded eagerly, turning to Richard. He spoke in Korean. "He wants to know if you are satisfied with the arrangement." Richard frowned slightly, clearly confused by the mundane question, but replied, "It is acceptable. We will take it all eventually." Gregory turned back to Dominic, the greasy smile firmly in place. "He says he loves the northern warehouses. Very spacious, perfect for his shipping containers." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dominic's jaw tightened. A microscopic shift, but a fatal one. The waitress was right. "Excuse me," Dominic said, his voice unnervingly smooth. He stood up, pushing his chair back. The legs scraped against the floorboards. "Nature calls. Keep Mr. Richard entertained, Gregory." Dominic walked out of the room. The moment the heavy mahogany doors closed behind him, his composure fractured into something cold and terrifying. He stepped into the dimly lit service hallway and saw the waitress. She was pressed against the wall, clutching her serving tray like a shield, her chest heaving. Her dark eyes widened in sheer panic as he approached her. Dominic stopped 2 feet away. He didn't crowd her. He didn't threaten her. He simply stared down at her, analyzing her. She was terrified. Raw, visceral fear radiated off her skin. This wasn't a rival plant. This wasn't a setup. This was a civilian who had just stepped onto a landmine because she couldn't keep her mouth shut. "What's your name?" Dominic asked, his voice a harsh whisper. "Nia," she stammered. Her grip on the tray turned her knuckles grey. "Where did you learn Korean, Nia?" "Taught English. In Busan. 4 years." She swallowed hard, avoiding his eyes. I just serve the food. I don't know anything. I shouldn't have said anything." Dominic reached out. Nia flinched, bracing for a blow, but his large hand simply wrapped around the edge of her silver tray, steadying it. "You did say something," Dominic murmured. "Now, tell me exactly what he said. Word for word. No summarizing." Nia licked her cracked lips. She closed her eyes, pulling the memory of the guttural syllables to the front of her mind. "He said, tell him we accept his terms, make him comfortable. The moment his trucks arrive at the North Dock tonight, we burn them with the drivers inside." Dominic's thumb dug into the metal of the tray. "And Gregory?" "Gregory told him you believed it, that they had the green light, and he would make sure your men were diverted." Dominic slowly released the tray. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just found a leak in his basement and was calling the plumber to rip out the foundation. "Go to the kitchen, Nia," Dominic ordered, his tone devoid of any warmth. "Go to the kitchen, stay away from the windows, and do not come back out to this floor until I personally tell you to." Nia didn't need to be told twice. She bolted. She pushed through the swinging doors into the chaotic heat of the kitchen, ignoring the head chef screaming for runners. She wedged herself between the walk-in freezer and a stack of dry goods, sinking to the greasy floor, waiting for the world to end. In the hallway, Dominic dialed a number. It rang once. "Cancel the trucks to the North Dock," Dominic said quietly into the receiver. "Send the heavy hitters instead, fully armed. Richard's boys are planning a bonfire." He paused, glancing back at the heavy doors of the private dining room. "And lock the front and back doors of the restaurant. Nobody leaves. I have some trash to take out." Behind the walk-in freezer, the floor tiles were coated in a permanent, sticky layer of polymerized grease. Nia's knees absorbed the damp chill of it, the slick grime soaking right through the thin, cheap fabric of her uniform slacks. She hugged her legs to her chest, burying her face in the space between her knees. The kitchen was a relentless sensory assault, the acrid sting of reduced balsamic vinegar burning on a neglected copper skillet, the rhythmic, mechanical roaring of the industrial exhaust hoods overhead. The sharp, nose-wrinkling tang of raw red onions mixed with industrial bleach. Usually this was just background noise, the chaotic but familiar soundtrack of a double shift. Tonight, it felt like the inside of a concrete coffin. She pressed her palms against her ears, but it didn't block out her own heartbeat. It thumped against her eardrums, a frantic, hollow sound. "Why did you do it?" she asked herself, her fingernails biting into her scalp. "Why didn't you just keep your mouth shut?" In this city, survival had a very simple rule book. Keep your head down. Pay your rent on time. Do not make eye contact with the sharks that swam through the VIP sections. Let the predators tear each other apart. It was none of her business if Dominic got shot on a dock. It was none of her business if Gregory bought a new condo with blood money. She wasn't a cop. She wasn't a hero. She was a waitress drowning in overdue electric bills. And now, because of some stupid, misplaced surge of adrenaline, she was a liability to a criminal syndicate. "Hey, Table 7 needs the sea bass right now." Paul, the head chef, roared from the expo line. He slammed his palm against the metal counter, ringing the service bell with a violence that made Nia flinch. Where the hell did Nia go? If she's in the bathroom on her phone again, tell her she's fired. Nia squeezed her eyes shut. The threat of losing her job suddenly felt like a punchline to a very dark joke. Then the kitchen doors swung open. It wasn't a waiter. It was 3 men. They didn't wear the crisp white aprons of the bussers or the neat vests of the floor staff. They wore dark, heavy coats, the kind of coats that concealed things. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized purpose, bypassing the prep stations entirely. The chaos of the kitchen died instantly. The clattering of pans ceased. The shouting stopped. Even the flames on the stove seemed to shrink. Paul, a man who routinely made grown men cry over improperly diced carrots, took one look at the intruders and stepped backward, raising his hands in a silent surrender. He didn't say a word. One of the men, a thick-necked enforcer with a scarred chin, walked directly to the back exit. He flipped the deadbolt, pulled a heavy iron chair from the break table, and wedged it under the door handle. He stood in front of it, arms crossed. The other two men moved to the swinging doors that led to the dining room, standing like stone gargoyles, their hands resting casually inside their coat pockets. Nobody leaves. That's what Dominic had said on the phone. Nia pressed herself harder against the aluminum siding of the freezer. The cold metal bit through her shirt, freezing the sweat on her spine. She tried to breathe quietly, inhaling the scent of frost and old meat leaking from the walk-in's compressor. 10 minutes passed, or maybe it was an hour. Time lost its shape, stretching into a thin, agonizing wire. The silence in the kitchen was heavier than the noise had been. The line cooks stood frozen at their stations, eyes darting toward the armed men. Then it started. It wasn't a cinematic explosion of gunfire. It wasn't loud or dramatic. That was the worst part. It was just sounds. Ugly, mundane sounds filtering through the heavy double doors of the dining room. First, there was a sudden, sharp scraping of wood against the floorboards, like a chair being kicked back violently. Then a voice. Gregory's voice. It wasn't the smooth, overly confident tone of a negotiator anymore. It was high-pitched. It was the desperate, breathless squeak of a cornered animal. The words were muffled, indistinguishable, but the panic in them vibrated through the walls. He was begging. Nia clamped her hands over her ears again, pressing hard enough to cause pain. She didn't want to hear. She didn't want to know. Her stomach roiled, a nauseating wave of acid crawling up her throat. She swallowed hard, tasting bile and cheap peppermint gum. A heavy thud vibrated through the floor. It was a dense, wet sound, like a sack of wet sand being dropped from a height. A short, guttural shout in Korean followed. Richard. He sounded furious, barking an order, but the shout was cut off abruptly by the sickening sound of glass shattering. Not a wine glass dropping. It sounded like a thick crystal snifter being smashed against something solid, something bone. Then nothing. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nia dragged oxygen into her burning lungs, her chest heaving in short, jagged gasps. Her hands shook violently. She stared at the cracked white tile between her shoes, a single drop of grease reflecting the harsh fluorescent light above. She had caused this. She had signed Gregory's death warrant. She had condemned Richard. She wasn't the one swinging the bottle or throwing the punches, but she was the one who had unlocked the cage. The guilt was instantaneous and crushing. It didn't matter that they were bad men. It didn't matter that Gregory was a traitor. The reality of violence was a filthy, staining thing, and she was covered in it now. The swinging doors to the dining room finally pushed open. The two guards standing near the entrance straightened up. Dominic walked into the kitchen. He still looked exactly the same. His charcoal suit was immaculate. His tie was perfectly straight. But as he stepped under the bright, unforgiving lights of the prep line, Nia saw the details. His knuckles were bruised, a dark, angry purple blooming across the pale skin. And on the crisp white cuff of his shirt, just barely peeking out from the sleeve of his jacket, was a single, stark drop of crimson blood. It was bright, fresh. Dominic didn't look at the trembling chefs. He didn't look at his armed guards. His dark, unreadable eyes swept the room, dissecting the space with terrifying precision. "Where is she?" he asked. His voice was completely calm, devoid of any adrenaline or exertion. It was the voice of a man asking for a glass of water. Paul pointed a shaking, flour-covered finger toward the walk-in freezer. Dominic walked down the narrow aisle between the stainless steel counters. His leather shoes made a soft, rhythmic tapping sound on the tile. To Nia, It sounded like the ticking of a bomb. He stopped at the end of the counter and looked down into the gap between the freezer and the dry goods rack. He found her. Nia looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, rimmed with unshed tears of pure terror. She couldn't speak. Her vocal cords were paralyzed. She just stared at the speck of blood on his cuff, her mind short-circuiting. Dominic stared back. He didn't smile. He didn't sneer. He just observed her, watching the way her chest violently rose and fell, registering the absolute, primal fear radiating from her posture. "Get up, Nia," he said quietly. Nia's legs refused to obey. She tried to push herself up, but her knees felt like wet paper. She slipped, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking uselessly against the greasy floor, and she slumped right back down against the freezer door. Dominic didn't offer his hand. He stood perfectly still, allowing her to struggle, watching her claw her way back to a standing position. He wasn't going to treat her like a child. She had stepped into a grown-up game. He was going to treat her like a player. When she finally managed to stand, she was practically vibrating. She had to lean heavily against the aluminum siding just to keep from collapsing. She was a few inches shorter than him, forcing her to tilt her head up to meet his gaze. The smell of him had changed. The mint and cold ash were still there, but now there was a sharp, metallic undertone. The smell of copper. The smell of adrenaline. "Are you going to throw up?" Dominic asked, his tone entirely flat. Nia swallowed hard, shaking her head minutely. "No," she rasped. Her voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. "Good." Dominic reached into his jacket pocket. Nia flinched violently, raising her hands to protect her face, turning her head away. She braced for the cold steel of a barrel, for the deafening crack, for the end. Instead, she heard the soft rustle of paper. She opened one eye. Dominic was holding out a thick, white envelope. It was unsealed. Nia stared at it, her arms still raised defensively. She didn't move. "Take it," Dominic ordered gently. Slowly, hesitantly, Nia lowered her arms. Her fingers trembled as she reached out and pinched the corner of the envelope. It was heavy, thicker than a deck of cards. She didn't have to look inside to know what it was. The coarse texture of the paper, the distinct shape. It was cash. A lot of it. "There's $50,000 in there," Dominic stated, his eyes locked onto hers. "Severance pay." Nia's breath hitched. She looked from the envelope to his face. Severance. "You don't work here anymore, Nia," he said smoothly. He took a step closer, crowding her space, forcing her to tilt her head further back. The proximity was deliberate. It was a show of absolute dominance. "You don't live in your current apartment anymore. You don't walk down these streets anymore. You take that money, you pack a bag tonight, and you get out of this city." Nia clutched the envelope against her chest. The paper felt warm against her cold hands. Are you kicking me out?" "I am saving your life," Dominic corrected, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low, vibrating hum that rattled in her chest. Richard's syndicate is massive. When they realize their proxy is missing, they are going to tear this restaurant apart looking for answers. They will interrogate the chefs. They will interrogate the busboys. They will pull the security footage and see a waitress whispering in my ear right before everything went to hell. He leaned in closer. Nia could see the tiny gold flecks in his dark brown irises. "If you stay here, they will find you," Dominic continued, his words slow and deliberate. "And when they find you, they will hurt you in ways that make what happened in that dining room look like a polite conversation. Do you understand me?" Naya nodded frantically. "Yes, I understand. You saved my empire tonight," Dominic said, his gaze shifting to the side of her face, tracing the line of her jaw before returning to her eyes. "You saved my life, and you saved my men. I owe you a debt that $50,000 doesn't begin to cover, but keeping you alive is the only way I can repay it." Nia looked at the blood on his cuff again. The money in her hands felt dirty. It felt like it was coated in the same grease that covered the floor. She hadn't wanted a reward. She had just wanted to stop a massacre. Now she was an exile, a fugitive from a war she had accidentally started. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered, the reality of the situation finally piercing through the shock. "Anywhere," Dominic replied. He stepped back, instantly restoring the cold, professional distance between them. "Just make sure it's far. And Nia?" She looked up at him. "Forget Korean," he said softly. "Forget you ever learned it. It's not a safe language for you anymore." Dominic turned on his heel. He didn't look back. He walked out of the kitchen, his dark coat swishing slightly, his armed guards falling into step behind him like shadows. The heavy swinging doors closed, leaving Naya standing alone by the walk-in freezer. The silence in the kitchen remained. The chefs were still staring at her. Paul looked at her like she was a ghost. Nia looked down at the envelope in her hands. She squeezed it, feeling the dense stacks of bills inside. Her old life was over. The mundane struggle of paying rent and wiping tables was gone, burned to the ground by a few translated syllables. She opened the back exit, slipping past the guard who had unwedged the chair. She stepped out into the freezing alleyway. The night air was sharp, smelling of wet asphalt and rotting garbage. Nia started to walk. She didn't look back at the restaurant. She didn't look back at the life she was leaving. She just walked, the heavy envelope pressed tightly against her beating heart, disappearing into the dark, unforgiving labyrinth of the city streets. Did Nia's terrifying night at the restaurant keep you on the edge of your seat? The criminal underworld is unforgiving, and her quick thinking changed everything. If you loved this intense, grounded mafia drama, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling story. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Nia's shoes?